Enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures. All right, welcome to the show, Gary Wayne. Gary, you're a Christian contrarian. You have a lifelong study into biblical prophecy, history, mythology, ancient texts, secret societies. We ask all our guests right away, what are your thoughts on Bigfoot?
Well, I do get asked that a lot. I didn't write about, Bigfoot in my book at all. It's a large book to begin with, and there's so many things to talk about once you start going down some of these rabbit holes. But, Bigfoot has this similar kind of historical mythos or legacy that comes down through prehistory. It's known both before and after the flood on all continents, all around the world except for Antarctica. Of course, we don't know what may come out of Antarctica at some point in time. They're large and hairy creatures, similar to how some of the Nephilim are described. So they seem to be sort of connected in that sort of aspect as well. They tend to have glowing eyes. And Nephilim were thought to have shining eyes. I don't know whether everybody has seen like the Stargate movies and the Stargate TV series, but they have those serpentine Goa'uld things that infest the bodies and their eyes glow. That would be sort of a depiction as to how bright these eyes were. And they were called the shining ones, so they could light up a room. So there's connections there, not that the Bigfoot eyes light up to the same degree. Bigfoot doesn't seem to be as large as a Nephilim, but again, kind of similar. They tend to live in caves. And of course, you have like the Horim, which are the hairy tribe of Rephaim, which are post-Diluvian Nephilim that are, Horim goes back to cave dwellers. So you have some etymology that sort of goes back to there. They tend to be intelligent and they tend to communicate. There's tapping on logs and things like that. So I look at the Bigfoot as being one of those Nephilim-like creatures, but distinct. Yeah. So in prehistory, you get a whole host of, we'll call it fabled, but probably not fabled, probably has a significant basis in reality, but fabled creatures that are populating the antediluvian world, but don't survive into the post-diluvian world. And I think they would be perhaps part of that. So just make some quick relationships. And they're also seemingly connected to portals, and they're also seemingly connected to the little people, which again is that sort of common historical legacy. So I don't know exactly what they are, but they seem to have, and again, they have names today on all continents. So it's this ongoing sort of living history or mythos that is very, very common to all cultures around the world.
Yeah. I have to say, we didn't talk about your book, Genesis 6 Conspiracy. I do have to tell you, my grandma's 97, and she told me she's reading your book. So,
excellent.
There you go.
So you can tell her that she can contact me anytime with questions or comments that she has, or on any other topic. And she can get hold of me through my website.
Yeah, we had a phone call about the Nephilim the other day, and then my mom's like, "Hey, Grandma's actually reading Gary Wayne's book," and I was just like, "This is great." She's 97. She ain't slowing down. She's going for it. And in the last 6 or 7 episodes, we've been talking about the Chimera creatures, and I'm starting to develop this opinion because I've been listening to stories of Bigfoot for the last 10 years or so, and on our show, we've been kind of exploring what they are. We've been talking a lot about the giants. I think Bigfoot might be a chimera of a primate and a spirit father. Can you talk to us about these chimerical creatures? The centaurs, the satyrs, the fauns, sirens, sphinx, fairies, werewolves, even jackalopes are considered in that family.
And the little people, Nate. Always the little people.
The little people.
Always Yeah. Well, and again, it's such a large topic, and
Sure.
so if we're going to talk about Chimera may be something that is unique from the other kinds of creatures, because if you look at a typical definition of Chimera in Greek mythology, or Chimera-like creatures like King Hubada of the cedar forest of Mount Hermon, or the unicorn in its traditional mythos, it has so many cross sort of pollination of parts, whether or not it's different types of feet, different kinds of tails, different kind of bodies. It's got a combination of animals, whereas typical creations that are in the sort of the Nephilim group and the greater Nephilim group, that would include Bigfoot and the little people, and understanding there's 3 groups of the elementals, which are part of the fairy people, which is part of 4 groups. So it's a fascinating topic. They tend to be more humanistic in their design, with something else that's going on there. So, and they all tend to have, in terms of their creation, a mythology that goes back to the creation from the gods, usually through sexual copulation. But you don't get this chimera effect. So I look at chimera as more of a DNA manipulation that is going on, that may be intermixed with a Nephilim, greater Nephilim concept type of creation, but is somehow distinct with all the different things that are going on. And when I say that, I mean, first people are going to say, well, before the flood and in prehistory, I mean, they didn't have any of this technology. Well, maybe that's not true. And in fact, I make a good case in the book that they had a technology that was greater than what we have today, and we're just catching up to. And with that being the case, as in the prophecy of Matthew, where it says, the days of, be the end time and the coming of Jesus will be like the days of Noah. So if we're just catching up to that DNA aspect of manipulation, and we're not in the end time yet, that means that we're catching up to that antediluvian technology. And I think that accounts for a lot of those different kinds of creations.
Can we back up real quick though? Because you started talking about the 3. Can you dive just a second? Talk about the 3 elemental and how that whole thing. I haven't heard that before. So
and I do cover a fair bit of the fairies in the book, but not into the detail that obviously is there. That's out there. So fairy is broken up into 4 major categories. Well, the first one is the proud ones and the rebellious ones that come from other planets, that from a Christian perspective we would understand as fallen angels, and they're led by the proud one. They have offspring, where the mythos of the Tuatha De Danann, the fairy people, come from. So those are the earthborn giants. They'd be similar to the Anunnaki and the earthborn Anunnaki, or the Nephilim, created by the sons of God. Then you have the third group, which is more like this ghost group, this demon group, banshees, phantoms, things like that are within the fairy mythology, which would be equivalent to demons in the Bible, bodiless spirits of the Nephilim that didn't go to sleep and weren't permitted to go to heaven and weren't sent to the abyss. And then you have the elementals. And the elementals are split into 3 groups, and they're all little people. And all around the world, again, you have 3 distinct groups. It doesn't matter whether or not it's Native American or it's Southeast Asia or wherever you go, you have a similar accounting of these little people that are created by the gods before the flood. And they all have specific agendas. So they typically get split into 3. And just to cover it off quickly, you have the ugly ones, which are like hobbits, dwarves, trolls, gnomes, those kinds of ones. And, just look at, Lord of the Rings, and you get a pretty good understanding of what some of these ugly ones are, and even some of the elves, but not the light elves or the white elves, which are larger beings. Then you have the good-looking ones, like the white elves, and then and they would be like, pixies, and they would be like Tinkerbell in Peter Pan, so good-looking ones, right? And then you have the third classification, which are the mischievous ones. So they'd be like leprechauns and trickster elves and things like that. So there's different names, and there's a whole bunch of different classifications of each of those in the group. So if I go back to, let's say, the group that are the ugly ones, you've got the dwarves, who are basically, and the hobbits are living in the earth, and the dwarves would be ones that manufactured weapons for the gods and the Nephilim. Just as they're depicted in the Lord of the Rings, and he has more of a Norse slant to his telling of the little people. And so you would also have like the gnomes, which looked after the technology, the genealogy, and the knowledge, and they're depicted the same as the little grays in terms of the alien mythos, and having flying machines come through portals, kidnap people, return them. They don't have any memories, and they're looking to sexual experimentations and things to continue their ability to produce. So that's sort of a quick sort of nutshell with a few examples.
Yeah. Man, it's wild. We heard stories of Henry Hudson getting drunk with some of these dwarves. It seems like some of them, we have some guests that say that they were around in the last 300 or 400 years, some people think, right? And some of these giants, people still see them too.
Well, and people still say that they're seeing the little people in association with Bigfoot. Yeah. Particularly in North America.
I'm a little concerned, Nate, that like what they call the ugly ones are typically mythologically bearded. Are there any of the beautiful ones that have beards? Because I hate to be grouped in that. I would think there'd be some beautiful bearded.
You got part Nephilim blood in you there, Luke.
I have not seen any ones or depictions of any ones or read of any ones that would have beards and would be part of the good-looking ones.
Oh, so
I'm sorry to tell you that.
So I guess Nate and I got to jump into the mischievous pot, because there are some bearded leprechauns. And
Yes. Yeah.
I have a question for you though. So could Nephilim, create chimerical creatures, or it's just the Watchers that are creating those creatures?
I tend to decide on the conclusion that it would have been the Watchers that would have been doing that. So the Nephilim would have been a creature that were procreated by the Watchers. They would have usurped the kingships both before and after the flood. They would have partnered with the mystical religion as being part of their organizational structure, which not only, had the worship of the gods, but held the cult of the knowledge that they had, and were developing that knowledge. And they would have had access to it. They may have even directed some of it in terms of what they would have wanted done. But it would have been either the priest class, which also in a lot of traditions are Nephilim as well, particularly in, let's say, with the Nagas, they produced a warrior ruling class and a Brahmin priest class, and they had a bloodline that went with it. The Tengu had a warrior class and a priest class, and the Tengu, if you're not familiar with that term, that's the bird-like Nephilim. That's in Southeast Asia. They look like sort of the Anunnaki. You might also take that out of the Xibalba that were bird-like, out of the Kishimaya and the Kamazots, which was the house of Kamazots within the Xibalba. And of course, if you Google Kamazots, you're going to bring up the typical sort of look of Batman. So just to tie a few other connections into there. So you have a priest class that would have been developing this knowledge, and in partnership on the specifics of those disciplines into the seven sciences and the knowledge that they would have received from the gods or the fallen angels, into the mystery schools and the secret societies that are manifested through the mystery schools.
And are they, so our understanding is like the Chimera is like the animal version of the Nephilim, so the fallen angels mated with women directly. These aren't like test tubes. They don't have science laboratories back then. Is this like bestiality?
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about, sexual copulation, you're talking about them actually mating or depositing their seed into those animals. And there's that possibility too. But typically as you get it, whether or not it's from, the little people, that's a copulation from fallen angels and, some sort of other type of being or a human presumably, to create these little people. And it's about how, if it's a sexual copulation, is how do what they produce through a sexual copulation produce something that's little people versus the large people, which would be the Nephilim. And you have to understand that if you understand who fallen angels are, you know that they're spirit beings. And that's where you get into a conundrum in Christianity where people say, well, there's no way they could have had sex because they're spirit beings. But we get lots of examples of angels taking the form of a human and other forms throughout the Bible, and that they ate and drank and talked and associated, touched and everything. So we know they can take a physical form.
Yeah.
And we get many different forms. So they seem to be able to take any form that they want. So if you wanted to take the form and pass on the DNA of that form through a sexual copulation, you would probably have to take a form that would pass that on. So I think that's how that sort of accounts for some of those things. And maybe they even took a shape of an animal. So when I talk about passing on that DNA, just let me sort of clarify that so people understand it. So the Watchers are thought to be the seraphim angels. Those are the fiery serpent-faced angels. And of course, we have Watchers in Daniel 4. And if you look into the structure of religion and government, both before and after the flood, they're dominated by serpent imagery, both of the gods and of the kings. And so it's thought that the seraphim angels produced serpent-like offspring as demigods. So that's why the kings were also depicted that way. And if you look at Akhenaten, if you were to ever Google that up and bring him up, you're going to see something that is, say, 1200 BC to 1400 BC, depending on the chronology that you're using, biblical or secular. He still has those serpentine attributes. He has that protruding chin, those high cheekbones, those large eyes that would have glowed, and with the wraparound eyes, he has that elongated skull, those thin lips.
Yeah.
And you're seeing a serpent-like face. And this is after, over 1,000 years since the blood, by using the flood, by using the biblical chronology, and over 2,000 years from the original Nephilim before the flood. So you can see still that serpentine look. You have what I talked about, the Anunnaki, the bird-like gods and angels producing the Tengu that I talked about with the Kamazat, Zibaba, Tengu, bird-like. You also have gods that are lion gods that are like Mahis or Nergal out of Sumeria, producing the lion men, and several different names and stuff that go along with that. And you also have gods like Anubis, which were a jackal or a dog god, producing offspring as well that looked like them. So that seems to be how they passed on that technology, but it doesn't answer the chimera question that you're talking about when you get all of these different parts. And I think that's the knowledge from heaven and the DNA manipulation in action.
There's a whole list. Some of them are 3-parters, 2-parters, 4-parters, 5-parters, like the jackalope supposed to have feathers like a bird, antlers like a deer, a rabbit body. So I guess the way you described it, this is how I see it. So you think a spirit could come down like a wolf. It's supernatural, but it looks like a wolf. It mates with a wolf, creates dogman werewolves. It's not like angels came down, they took human body form, and they mated with women, and then they created the giants. They could do the same thing with they can make themselves become any animal, mate with that animal, and that animal's offspring is going to be supernatural.
By passing on that physical DNA that makes that physical form. And that's actually based in some scripture too. So in Jude 1:6, people were to bring that passage up. It'll talk about the fallen angels and the crimes they committed before the flood in the time of Noah. And they left their habitation. That habitation is the Greek word oikoterion. Oikoterion means a dwelling place for the spirit. if you go over to 1 Corinthians 5, you get the only other application as a house in heaven for oikaterion, which is the dwelling place for the spirit. But it's also talking about the clothes of heaven in terms of the form that you have up there in the spirit, and the clothes of the earth, which are the form that spirit beings take in the physical world. And they need that dwelling place for the spirit. They need a physical body to interact with it. They can be in the world in a spirit form, but they can't interact. But with a physical body, they have a dwelling place where they can interact, eat, talk, have sex. And if you think about that now with the demon spirits, which are thought to be and I have a great document on that, on all this oikaterian stuff. I have like 3 documents on that, and one on the demons, for the case for demons, is that when their bodies die, because in Genesis 6:3, life is limited to 120 years. And they had received from their gods, or the fallen angels, the immortal spirit. God limits that to 120 years. So the body is no longer immortal. So it dies. But the spirit's not able to go to sleep, and it's not able to go to heaven. So we've talked about that previous. But what's important about that is, as we, let's say, roll forward to some New Testament documentation of demons, particularly at the time of Jesus, and Jesus is dealing with demons and possession all of the time. He talks about these demon spirits as being in dry places, and they're thirsting for a place to land, which is a body, because they can't rest and they can't interact. They need a body to interact with the world. That's that oikaterian dwelling place that they're looking for. So I'm not just sort of pulling some of this stuff out of the air. I just and I'm not saying that you're saying I was saying that, but for the audience, I want them to know that there's information on this that sort of makes sense, and it has a consistent story to it.
And do we see the same kind of story with the Watchers and the interaction with what we call the Watchers and the fallen angels and humanity? Does that narrative also exist across other cultural and religious texts, oral traditions, and the same? So we're not just pulling this out of scripture. This is a common theme across humanity, correct?
This is a worldwide legacy that we have. So in all cultures, on all continents, again, you have the creation of humans and you have the creation of the giants, and they're related to the flood in both, in all accounts of it. And the giants are named by many different people around the world. So in the subcontinent of India, and of course you have, these seraphim gods there, they're called nagas, right? Or you have the dragon serpent gods in China, or you have the plumed and feathered serpent in the Chimeras. These are all seraphim angels that are being described around the world, and they're thought to be the Watchers.
Yeah.
And the Watchers look after government and religion, as they're depicted in 3 times in Daniel 4. So you have got, in the subcontinent of India, they're called the Danuwa, and they're called the Daitya, and they're called the Asura. So several different names, and they're called titans or heroes in Greek mythology. And people will say, wait a minute, titans are gods. Well, yeah, but Atlas is a titan, and he's also the offspring of Poseidon and Clymene, or Clydo and Iapetus, depending on which version that you're reading, and he's also a hero. So they're called both. So
right, Hercules was the same, right?
The Hercules, he's the son of Zeus,
right.
Or Theseus or Perseus. These are all different types of Nephilim, and they're demigods, and a demigod is defined in antiquity as the offspring of a human female and a god.
Yeah.
Right? And you have the Myosi in China, and you have the Anunnaki in Sumeria, and you have the Xibalba in the Chimeras, and the names go on and on and on. Then again, after the flood in the Bible, we get all of these other names as well, and we're not told exactly how they show up after the flood, and there's a few different ways, but these are the Rephaim. These are the post-diluvian giants, and they also have a lot of vernacular names, whether it's the Kadami, or it's the Horim, or it's the Avim, or the Zamzuzim, or the Zuzim, or the Emim, or the Anakim. I don't go through all of the names, but none of them have patriarchs in the Bible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
This is like Goliath, correct? The same idea.
Yeah, so Goliath is called a giant, and giant goes back in the Old Testament, except for 3 times, to the word Rapha. Rapha can mean a ghost in one of the applications, which is thought to be the demon. It also can mean physician, and it can also be a tribe of giants. So you have to check which word is being used in that application and what does it go back to into the original Hebrew for the meaning, because they're different numbered words. They're all part of the same root, because it's thought that the Nephilim had self-healing qualities, as in that physician sort of aspect. So it is connected, but it can also be used for, medicine and doctors and things like that. So again, you have to pick the right meaning, because Hebrew words can have several different meanings.
Yeah.
And so, and I am is the male plural, and it can also be translated as ones. So you could look at as the giant ones, whether it's Nephilim, which is the other 3 times, which comes from the Hebrew word Nephil with the I am male plural, and that comes from the word Nephal, which is the fall. Which is thought to be representative of the fallen, but the I am one, the fallen ones. And so you would have the Nephilim of the earth in that case, and the Nephilim of the heaven, just as you've got the Titans of earth and the Titans of heaven, got the Anunnaki of earth, the Anunnaki of heaven. You get that sort of consistent understanding that there's 2 types of gods. One's a full god, one's a demigod. One's from an offspring of the human female, as the definition of demigod goes. So yes, so he is called a giant. That goes back to Rephaim, as opposed to the antediluvian giants, which are Nephilim. And the other 2 times, it's used 3 times. Once in Genesis 1:6-4, and then in the exaggerated report of Numbers 13:33, where the Anakim are said to be giants, which goes back to the word Nephilim. And that is an exaggeration to scare the Israelites, because the Anakim were Rephaim, as they're defined in Deuteronomy 2, not Nephilim. And so I think the Nephilim may have been bigger and slightly different somehow, some way, but the Bible certainly distinguishes between Nephilim and Rephaim, both of them defined as giants.
The breeding going on here. I mean, so like our show, we started with Bigfoot, and what I've listened to you on several podcasts, and you really know Narnia well. And I think the more this show goes on, the weirder Narnia gets. Because that's why I asked that question earlier, if Nephilim could have created some of these other things, because it seems like as they're breeding, the giants are getting smaller. They're still passing on their spiritual DNA. You know, like my thought is, if these things entered into the world as like a gorilla, this spirit gorilla mates with another gorilla, they create Bigfoot. Some of these Nephilim mate with humans. They create a different breed of giants. It just seems like there's a lot of interbreeding going on. It's really complicated.
There is. It gets very complicated, and which makes it such a fascinating subject. And so you're talking about the second class of hybrids in terms of the Nephilim, because you have the hybrid angelic and human, and of course different kinds of Nephilim, as we've talked about. But in Genesis 10, you have the Canaanites. And Canaan comes out of the family of Ham, and he produces Heth, which produces the Hittites, and Sidon, which produces the Sidonite people. But then you have all of these other names that don't have a patriarch. You have the Amorites, you have the Jebusites, and Ardvites, and the Archavites, and Jebusites, and there's just this whole family. And family goes back to the Hebrew word, which basically means a different kind or a different species. And there's no patriarch. And I said, except for the Rephaim after the flood, all the different people have a genealogy that goes back to Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles, which are the offspring of Noah, his wife, and the 3 sons and their wives that create all of this offspring that's listed. Except for one exception. We do get Arba, who is the father of the Anak, or the Anakim. That's the only Rephaim sort of patriarch to one of the branches that we get. So these ones are all patriarchless, which makes no sense. So where did they come from? Well, I think, and as we look at, let's say, Amos, it talks about the Amorites as being the size of the cedars of Lebanon. Now, that's a simile. It's a metaphor. It's not totally literal, but the cedars of Lebanon were the giant trees of the ancient world, and they built all of the ancient sites out of them. They were 36 to 40 to 50 feet tall, but it's a simile. So we know they're taller than the Israelites, but they're probably not as big as the Anakim or the Rephaim. right? They're hybrids. And the Amorites are one of these families that are in these families of nations. And these are the nations where the daughters of Canaan, the daughters of Sidon, daughters of the Hittites would have married a Rephaim patriarch and produced a hybrid class of giants that are bigger than humans but smaller than the Rephaim. So back now to Numbers 13:33, as you read that, as the scouts are reporting back what they saw in the Promised Land, they see 3 Anakim kings, which are Rephaim, as Deuteronomy 2 classifies them at. And that's Talmai, Sheshai, and Ahiman. And they also see people that are mightier than the Israelites and taller, and all of them living together in these high-walled cities. These are the Amorites, the Amalekites. These are the hybrids that come out of the patriarchs marrying in of the Rephaim marrying into the Canaanites that are ruling in the covenant land. So you have those two groups of people. And those details are confirmed in Deuteronomy 1 after Israel moves out from the desert. So we know the details of the scouts is accurate, but it's the exaggeration of the Nephilim, which is designed only to scare Israel from going into the land at that time.
Gary, if we move forward in time now, since we're looking backwards, is there any thought that some of this DNA still exists in humanity today? Are we looking at, did that all get wiped out? Or, I mean, this is always fascinating to me to look backwards and say, this has happened. Is any of that stuff left? Because I know the Bible specifically, in the biblical worldview, we look at lineage. It was very important to make sure that Jesus came from a line of humans, right? There was no marring of that lineage. Now, the rest of humanity, and if we fall in there somewhere, it makes me wonder about today.
Well, it's a very good question. And, the giants didn't disappear with the flood. They show up again after the flood. And in the time of the Exodus, we know they're fighting against giants. And giants show up after they take the covenant land and all throughout the time of the judges and with the countries that are still around, and particularly with the Philistines and the Amalekim and the Horim, and even into David and Saul's lifetime as they're fighting the Philistines. Right. And the Bible never says they wiped the Rephaim from the face of the earth. What they did do, though, if you start linking into some of the information that I provided earlier, is that they usurped the kingships and they created the great dynasties. Mm-hmm. But they would try and continue to intermarry to keep those bloodlines pure. But then if you're not careful, you start to create blood diseases that we would know today as hemophiliac disease or Habsburg lockjaw disease.
Right. There's no branches in your family tree. At some point it ends, right? If it's a straight line.
Yeah. So they had to introduce lower levels of hybrids intermarrying with humans to prevent the diseases. And that's why, again, as we talked about earlier, you see a degradation of that look and size, just as witnessed by the Akhenaten statue. Right. So not fully giant, not fully serpentine, but you see that sort of evolution as that gets intermarried. It's interesting that all of the royal families today trace their genealogies back to prehistory, and they say they have these genealogies, and that they trace those genealogies back to the giants, to the Rephaim and the Nephilim, and to specific fallen angels. And the purity of that bloodline is where they fit in the hierarchy of the cult. Most people think that the Rh negative bloodline is the bloodline of the Nephilim and the Rephaim. And typically, like the Windsors, for example, would have O negative. And Rh negative tends to be a significant part of the royal family's bloodlines. And so there's a connection there, whether it's real in the Rosicrucians and all the other mythologies about this is the bloodline of the giants and the fallen angels. Where people come along and they kind of debunk that, and I don't talk about Rh negative in my book, I just talk about the genealogies and their bloodlines and how they take that back into to prehistory, into the giants and to the fallen angels. Is Rh negative is missing something. It's missing the antigens, as opposed to the positive that has the antigen. So the standard argument is this, that it can't be inserted into the human bloodline because it's missing something. If you're inserting something, you can't insert something that's missing, right? So, but it doesn't, that is only part of the story. So let's me just back one step further, and I'll get to the point of your question, is that 15% of the population has Rh negative blood. It's heavily predominant in royal families. It's the most predominant in the area of Western France, where it runs at about 20% to 25% sort of saturation levels. And the most saturated levels of Rh negative are the Basques, who say they are Homo Atlantis and they survived the flood and they started Egypt, Sumeria, Scythia, and settled in northeast and west Spain after the flood. And one of the reasons why they had a diaspora, they had a falling out with the other bloodlines. So we have Rh negative that is somehow comes into the human bloodlines. We're not sure how or when, but can't really insert it. So people would say, if you're talking about insertion, it would have to be Rh positive. Except that to have any type of bloodline, you need DNA that's going to, and genes to manufacture that type of blood. So that's where you kind of have to go to. Now, what they call that in their cult and in their belief system is the gene of Isis. Isis being a mother goddess and thought to have created, offspring giants as well. And being a mother goddess, obviously there's that fertility aspect, and that's also the root word the occult would use for Genesis. It's this gene of Isis that produces the Rh negative blood that gets passed on. So people should probably be looking more for the gene as opposed to what is manifested from the gene. That is the spark of the divine that the New Age and Eastern religions and polytheists believe in, that they're trying to collect in a universal religion and a world government so that they can evolve back into the demigods of old.
And Isis is directly related to the raising of Osiris, right? Because she's the one giving that spark, and that has a lot to do. That ceremony itself and that, mythology dogma has a ton to do with raising a spirit from what we would consider to be where the Watchers are, correct? Isn't that word?
Yeah. Well, it would be a spirit of the demigods.
Right.
Because a fallen angel spirit is immortal.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
That's wild.
And that's why you have that sort of allegory of Egypt mysticism as part of Freemasonry.
Yeah.
It's all interconnected into that polytheist and Gnostic belief system. And
just to get back to some of these creatures, why do these centaurs, fawns, werewolves, why do they have human body parts? Why aren't they, you know what I mean?
Well, what's interesting about the centaurs is that they're not necessarily created from a copulation. They are created in a cloud. And so one starts to wonder, what does that cloud mean? That seems to suggest off Earth, and it's not a sexual copulation. So is it a DNA manipulation? And so when we look at those kinds of things, then that's a distinct possibility. I mean, it could be just sort of an allegory within the myth, but that's what it says. And there's only one other creation that I know of that is also created in a cloud. And that's the Amaka Seth giant out of the Gnostic belief system, which is a precursor to the giants that the Gnostics believe were also created in Genesis 6. He was also created in a cloud and set down in Gomorrah before the flood, and then replanted again in Sodom after the flood, as I think it's the Tablet of Seth and the Gospel of Judas talks about. So you have that being sort of understood as, okay, maybe those are DNA manipulations for similar kinds of beings. Now, the centaurs in mythology actually taught many of the heroes, whether it's Hercules or Perseus.
Really?
Yeah. So it was they were a distinct race and lived on a particular island, and they were highly educated and were thought to taught a lot of the demigods. So Yeah, it's an interesting mythology for sure.
Because people still see these things. You know, they still see the Dogman. They still see the fawns. They still see Goatmen to this day. So somehow they survived, like hiding out underground, wherever.
Again, we don't understand why fully are they before the flood, and then they show up again after the flood. So I think would be very similar to how the Rephaim show up after the flood. I think my favorite position is that there is a second incursion, a second restart of this technology, religion, illicit, illegal creations that violate the laws of creation. And there are other ways, as in the survival story on another ark in another way, or somehow on the ark, but it doesn't really answer the greater question of all these other beings unless they have survival stories as well, off the earth, in the earth, on ark, whichever way you want to go on that. I would tend to settle for a second sort of creation, and I begin that sort of understanding at Babel, where you have Nimrod, who's the first Grand Master of the Freemasons after the flood, writes the Constitution, and he receives this knowledge from Hermes, who finds the knowledge that's hidden under the pyramids in 36 vaults, or 36,525 books in 9 vaults stacked underneath the pyramids. And it brings us back to Nimrod, and that allows them the technology to start building the city. They introduce the Babel religion, and all the languages are confused. And then you have Nimrod staying in Sumeria, intermarrying with the bloodlines of the giants there, and Hermes going over with Mizraim over to Egypt, starting the second pillar of the religion after the flood, where the mystical religions all sort of take their root from either from Sumeria or from Egypt. And so in that you get the knowledge, right? And we also get told that Nimrod became a mighty one, or Gibberim, which is used to describe giant. But we know Nimrod is the son of Cush. So he's not the offspring of a male, at least a male angel. And somehow he becomes and became is a word where he's like violating an oath or something. So not only rebelling and starting this religion, but something else changes. And so that may be where the knowledge where he becomes. But becomes a mighty one. But it's this knowledge, if they had that DNA manipulation, or you have a second incursion that's happening in and around the time of Babel and the reemergence of illicit knowledge, those angels would have gone to the abyss as well for those crimes and would have had to have been replaced by other fallen angels, as witnessed by Psalms 82 with the council of the gods. And so you would probably have had a second incursion of that knowledge in creation after the flood, which would account for the other beings. Other than that, they went through portals or something like that and resurfaced again after the flood. And again, when you go back to Tolkien, at the end of his trilogy, and it's all about the antediluvian epoch and all the different kinds of peoples and things, you see them going away on a boat, on a water, which is an allegory for the flood, and they're going to another location through another portal because now it's the age of man. And so that's where the portal type of theory sort of comes back, where just as one example, where they have been repopulating and showing up since the flood through portals.
Do you think guys like Tolkien, C.S. Lewis saw all of this? They understood this part of the Bible, and they were just writing these, trying to give people breadcrumbs to the actual stories in the Bible that for some reason people just deny exists?
No, I will actually have a little different take on that. So if you understand that the elite are made up of the bloodlines of the Rephaim and the Nephilim, and they controlled the religion, and they controlled the nobility, and they controlled the education, and they've controlled the literature from, the beginning, whether or not it was before the flood or after the flood. Then you understand that a lot of the literature is basically their literature and history, right? Now, when we look at the knowledge that Tolkien and Lewis had, it's extraordinary. And they're taken into the Inkling Society, which is a Rosicrucian Golden Dawn order of writers at Oxford, while they're in their early 20s, which makes no sense because they have no record of being Freemasons. right? And you needed to be an adept Freemason to be in with any sort of Rosicrucian group, where they develop these writing skills and the stories from the knowledge of the Rosicrucians, who also believe they go back, as with the bloodlines of the elite, back to the gods and the Nephilim. So how does that happen? Well, in the pure bloodlines, you are initiated from childhood, and you actually become an adept before you're allowed to have the title. You have to be close to the age of 30 to be able to accept an adept title. So you have these two bloodline writers who get introduced in Oxford to the Inkling Society to write about their history without having to be Masons, right? Because they're part of the Royal Masons, which the top half of the Rosicrucians are all purebloods. So in the 6-part series of documents that I produce and I give out to people who are looking for it, 5 and 6 trace the bloodlines of Tolkien and Lewis. And they go right back to the royal bloodlines.
So they had some sort of prior knowledge of all this stuff, and that's why they could
Yes.
create these worlds. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was honed into a writing skill, and maybe even provided a little bit more, but they would have been super adepts, right? They would have been of the purebloods. So it's not really the Golden Dawn Society providing the knowledge, they're providing the skill craft. And that has a history, whether or not you go back to the Spear Shaker Society that Shakespeare and Bacon were part of, or the Knights of the Helmet, which was another writing society where they wrote, again, their history and their genealogies. And of course, in Shakespeare, you get fairies and giants and all sorts of different things in genealogies. This is part of that whole writing society to keep their history alive, but in plain sight, that they were continuing.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, so our last guest said something. He said that the thesis of the Bible would be the serpent seed versus the woman seed. And there's this war going on all the time. So you think some of these guys are in with the serpent seed? They are... Is there just two sides, or is there multiple? Are there more than two sides? Because there's certainly thousands of creatures. Sometimes, you know, a lot of previous guests have described some of these beings as sort of neutral, like they weren't always evil. They actually sometimes did good things, like Bigfoot will save a human being. You know, there's just weird stories of neutrality. What do you think about all that?
Well, that makes sense in the dualistic polytheist religion. So on the macro level, you have good versus evil that is in perpetual conflict and always will be, and neither side will win. But you also have duality within polytheism. That's at the lower level. And so you have white magic and you have black magic. You have some good Nephilim and you have some bad Nephilim. So like Hercules would be considered a good Nephilim. You have black witches and white witches, and good kings and evil kings. I mean, so you have that duality that's in it, and that's all kind of relative as to which side that they're on. But directionally, even though you have rivalries, and there's lots of rivalries, and I'll come back to that in a second, directionally, they're all moving in the same direction. But they're all power hungry. And for them, the ultimate goal is who's going to be, as in like the fairy sort of Nephilim allegory story of the Highlanders, there can only be one, right?
Yeah.
And there's only going to be one ruling family when it all settles out that's going to start a dynasty of a ruling class that will rule for eternity in that sort of belief system in their, as they present their dragon messiah. So you have that duality. But what I point out to people is it's what you do which is either good or evil, right? And so it's my belief system that, and I know some people will disagree with me, is that if they accepted God and Jesus as their savior, they would be saved if they didn't violate the laws of creation themselves, right? If they received it innocently, let's say, as offspring. Whether or not they're capable of doing that or want to do that, but I know a lot of people would disagree with me on that. Just as knowledge is neither good or evil, it's how it's used.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that does make a lot of sense to me, but whether or not they're neutral, proactive on one side or another side, they're all working towards the same end, and they all, unless they renounce their allegiance and the worship to the pantheon of gods, it's kind of irrelevant if they do a few good things or not.
So is Satan the head of all these gods?
Yes.
Is there one entity? Okay. Yeah.
Yes. And again, as Isaiah 14:12 talks about, and that's the Latin word Lucifer, which is the god of the Freemasons, also known as the great architect of the universe, and a few other names, inserted for a Hebrew word, which is Hail El, which is typically an angelic name that shows up in the King James Version Bible. And in those verses, I know I go down a lot of rabbit trails.
No, it's all right.
Satan wants to be raised up like God, to have his throne in heaven like God. And to be like God would put him at the top of that pantheon.
Yeah.
And then all the other angels would be like, you would have like the 7 archangels. Well, he would have a counterfeit 7 archangels. And then as that comes down, you have that whole hierarchy that's going to be very similar to the hierarchy in heaven. So around Satan's throat, he would have some Ophanim. Those would be the wheel angels. You would have the cherubim, and would have other seraphim. Because in all the different ranks and levels of angels, some of each would have rebelled.
Okay. So when, there's lots of times you heard those like unforgivable sins and things like that growing up. When you take something and you make an abomination of it, is that sort of sealing your fate on this side? Like you've taken something pure and you've corrupted it, so therefore you are aligning your allegiance to the dark side, so to speak?
Well, what we're told is that there's only one sin that's not forgiven, and that's a blasphemy or a sin against the Holy Spirit. And I think that's probably linked to creation violations, like creating of Nephilim and physically doing that. The other sin that seems to be related is taking the mark of the beast, which is willfully done. You will choose to do that, and it either changes your DNA, and it's also implicated as worshiping Satan and the Antichrist. And so again, that may be a violation against the Holy Spirit as well, or it's just the worship of is just isolated to that last 3.5 years. It's not clear, but one would think if you're worshiping Satan, you are violating, a sin that's not going to be forgiven, because it's only those who take the mark and worship Antichrist or Satan in the last 3.5 years and the fallen angels that are going to go to the lake of fire and burn forever.
What happens to all these creatures? How do most of them get wiped out? Is it just the flood? Are we killing them? Are human beings in their hearts know these things are evil and we're going after them and we're hunting them down? What do you think about that?
I think we have a long history showing that they were hunting Nephilim and other creatures throughout history, and they became fewer and fewer and fewer. And even in North America, where you have the legacy of the red-headed giants and the Native Americans, they were at odds and war, just as you go down through South America. I would lend that to the other groups as well, because typically associating with any of those groups after a while doesn't turn out well for humankind.
Yeah.
So, it may start off well, but typically it doesn't. And so the only places where these beings can seemingly exist in the physical world would be in isolated locations like in mountains and in caves, and also understanding that mountains and caves are always intricately linked with portals, just as people think that Bigfoot disappears through portals to the other side, just as fairies come through fairy mounds and fairy dolmens, and the word dolmen means portal. And if you Google DOLMEN, you're going to get this mini sort of Stonehenge type of figure pops up. These are all over the world. Just as at Gilgal Raphaim, which is the Wheel of the Giants or the Wheel of the Spirits, and it's got a few different names, that's on the Golan Heights at the foot of Mount Hermon, was one of the most holy polytheist sites after the flood. And of course, the Raphaim are giants. It has hundreds of portals and dolmens within that site. And this is where the Ugaritic text talks about the Raphaim kings as being the travelers from going to one side to the other side, to the other side. To the other, to the other, to the other, to the other.
why is there such a huge group of people who don't see any of this? And also, like, what's happening there? Are they just ignorant, or is there something else going on? Some people say, why does Jesus not talk about any of this stuff? And some people say, well, he does, you just don't realize it. What do you think about all that?
Well, I would say that a number of things to that is that let's start with Jesus and work back in terms of and unpack what you were talking about. So, Jesus actually goes to Caesarea Philippi, to Mount Hermon, and to the Rock of the Gods, or the Gate of Hades, where the Pan Temple is, where the Baal Temple is, and announces there that he's going to build his church with Peter and the disciples, right?
On this rock, he says. Yeah,
on this rock, yeah. So he clearly goes there, and again, I have a couple of good documents on that, and several good documents on Mount Hermon and everything that's going on there. But he does recognize that he's dealing with the demons, right? And they're afraid that he's going to send them with the legion ones to the lake of fire before their time, right? Or to the abyss. And so all of this is in play. He's dealing with Satan in the desert, who is offering him, at his most weakest point, all of the kingdoms of the world that he controls. It's there if you're looking for it.
Yeah.
But people have been brainwashed not to look for it. They've been given stories, whether it's about giants aren't real, or let's not talk about prophecy, or let's not talk about prehistory. They've been dumbed down to not look for it and accept another possible pounded in concept and belief system. So they're taught to reject those types of things. And you have to want to wake up from that. Otherwise, you'll just continue to just dismiss it. You'll continue to suppress it. They control the schools. They control the media. They control the education. They control the literature. They control the entertainment. They control the news. And they continually brainwash people, because what they really don't want, particularly in this age of education, where you don't have that feudal system that they used to have set up, which I think they're trying to recreate so they can really more effectively dumb down the level of understanding, is they don't want people to realize that their whole hierarchy and organizational structure of society was created by these monsters.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you see it big time now. I mean, I have never seen so many people either shaming people for sharing conspiracy theories or sharing conspiracy theories. It's like there's a huge camp of people who are, like QAnon conspiracy's gone mainstream. Everyone's tweeting about it.
Yeah.
Facebook's shutting it down. I mean, the whole world, I think in 2020 is waking up that, maybe stuff's not what I always thought it was. Is there a danger there though? Like, are we going to believe anything and everything?
Well, we do today.
How do you know you go too far?
Well, this is all about how things are designed to play out. And it has to play out. And understand that we don't control the world. It's the God of this world is Satan, and it's controlled by the Council of Gods and the 70 original nations that have assigned a hierarchical god to each of those 70 nations. And the Nephilim were created to run the government and the kingships, and the priest class to control the polytheist religion, and their larger family to be the elite and the nobility, so that the humans would serve them, right? That's what was created. So they're going to keep that information dumbed down. They're going to give you misinformation to sort of discredit anybody getting too close to what they're actually wanting to do, until they're ready to spring this information on the world. They want to be in control of how that comes about. They know they have a date with destiny. They want that date with destiny, but they need to get there first. And it's always Christianity, for the most part, that is their greatest enemy. Not that the other two monotheist religions aren't huge obstacles, but it's that Jesus deification aspect that makes Christianity the biggest foe and the most difficult to deceive. So they need to prepare Christianity and then destroy it from within and de-deify Jesus to bring about that rendezvous with destiny that they want to bring about, which permits the universal religion, which brings the 10-king government, which brings along the dragon Messiah that they want to present from their bloodlines.
Yeah. Are all leaders on a side?
For the most part. I won't. I mean, it's too hard to research all of them, but typically, you're going to have leaders presented to you, which are all of the same belief system and all directionally globalist in trying to bring about the new world order that I like to call the Nephilim world order. And the 10 king empire, which is a series of groups of nations or spheres of influence or trading blocks, whatever you want to call them, that are going to form the end time world empire. So you got like all of these groups like NAFTA and EEC. Those would be those types of groups of nations. And typically that goes back to also what the Club of Rome was created to do in the late 60s, which they divided the world up, you guessed it, into 10 groups of nations. And they want to bring forward the allegory of the new Atlantis that Francis Bacon or Rosicrucian wrote, which is the 10. And if you know anything about Atlantean history that comes through Plato in Timaeus and Critias, there was 10 Nephilim kings that were thought to be the helm of civilization and world government in the antediluvian world before they were destroyed. And so that's what they're trying to bring back again. So yeah, I mean, it is all sort of designed to have this come about, but in a way that they want to bring it about, and with the timing that they want to bring it about. And so they're going to control that knowledge.
Gary, do you think we are in the days of Noah, as the prophecy talks about again? And do you think that we'll see an incursion or an uptick in sightings of creatures and the unexplained, because the scriptures say that the end times will be like the days of Noah?
Yeah, and that's and a lot of people will look at that and say, well, he's just talking about people weren't expecting the end and the violence that went on. And they like to sort of encapsulate that. But it follows the fig tree generation. And so you get two macro signs after all of the birth pang signs and all the details in the chronology of the events that Jesus provides. And Jesus, being the Word of God and the Spirit of prophecy, would choose his words perfectly and accurately. And so if you go back to Genesis 9:28-29, where it encapsulates the life of Noah, it says, "And the days of Noah was." Right?
Yeah.
So he's using those exact same words, even though that was recorded in Greek and the Old Testament was recorded in Hebrew. The words are identical, meaning the same thing. So he chose that for a reason. And it says in chapter 9 that Noah lived 600 years before the flood and 350 years after the flood. And those are what the days are going to look like. So we have to look at what happened in the life of Noah, what happened with the flood, what happened with the giants, what happened with Babel, what happened with Sodom, and understand that all of this is going to be like the days of Noah. And that's why the Babylon religion is a post-Diluvian event allegory with the Babel religion, where you have an Antichrist type figure with a polytheist religion, which is the analogy for the end time. So we need to understand that, because nothing new is under the sun. Now, in terms of the macro application to that, you have the fig tree generation. So a generation in the Psalms is 70 years, or in Genesis 6:3 would be 120 years. We don't know whether it goes to the extent of either one of those two numbers or which number it is. And all end time prophecy is centered around the southern kingdom of Judah controlling Jerusalem, as opposed to the creation of the state of Israel, which creates that opportunity, which happened in 1967.
Yeah.
So I would look for that as being the countdown of the fig tree generation, and we're in the birth pangs of that, which are earthquakes, rumors of war, pestilence, and pandemics. And those will get stronger and stronger and stronger as you get to the time of the opening of the seals. So, yes, I do believe that, from that we would be in that last generation, simply because we don't get two sets of prophecies where the southern kingdom is going to come back, and you can't have conflict in prophecy. So it's got to come together, and that seems to be the only way that comes together. So having said all of that, as we close in on the end time, we have to see more of these things coming about.
Yeah. It's amazing how Bigfoot can lead you to the end of the world, right? Like, if you follow it logically.
It's all connected.
It's weird. It's like some people are just like, some of my friends they're open-minded to the supernatural stuff, listening to the show, and they're like, I got a little biblical on that last one, and I'm like, well,
Yep.
Bible and Bigfoot, they go together. I don't know how to explain it, but they just do. So, it sounds like DNA wars. You have wars of DNA going all the way back to the dawn of time. What about some of these other creatures? Is salvation extended to these creatures? Can Nephilim choose God's side, or are they just permanently doomed? And we have you make it sound like we're going to be presented with a DNA upgrade at some point, and if we take the DNA upgrade, we have converted ourselves to.
Well, I think you violated a law of creation, and I think when you do that, you're doing a loyalty and a worship to the other side, and I think that's sort of where you cross the Rubicon River, so to speak, right? That's the line in the sand. So, but DNA manipulation is going to be, I think, more and more involved in terms of being delivered through the healthcare system. It's much more efficient to have implants delivering with AI things automatically, and that tends to work at the genetic level and the subatomic level. So that would make some sense. I would also say that if you are going to try and prepare the world to stand up against the God of the Bible, that they will classify as something like the dark side of the Force and the forces in Star Wars.
Sure.
You are going to have to convince people you have a chance to win. And so it's one thing to have angels or aliens with fantastic weapons and technology. They have to develop that with us so that we can join them in that fight for freedom, is how it will be pitched. And so they need to rapidly advance that knowledge, which I think we've been going through. And I think they need and want to have Chimera type creations for war. So when you get to Revelation 9 and the 200 million man war, which happens just before the midpoint of the last 7 years, and match that up with Joel 1 and 2 and the Gog war of Ezekiel 38 and 39, Gog being a giant, and Magog of the land of giants, were both giants in the Greek pantheon of offspring of either Poseidon or Iapetus, again, depending on which account that you're reading. You have these creatures that are clearly chimera, right? Different bodies and heads and things like that. And I think they're going to be creating those with these new weapons of war and other technology that will give an appearance that humans can stand up with them against the God of the Bible and his angels. And I also think they're creating technology through clone bodies and other possible things that you could create a habitation for the demon spirits so they can join that battle in the physical world and have a dwelling place for their spirit. And so I think that technology is being developed for that as well. And you have in Revelation 9, which happens just before the midpoint of the last 7 years, an opening of the abyss, where you have all of the imprisoned angels and all of the Rephaim and Nephilim kings, which Ezekiel 31 and 32 talks about being imprisoned along the sides of the abyss, or as the creatures that are described in the Pistis Sophia. If anybody ever wants to read that or wants to get a hold of me, I'll send you, to the short version of that describes all of these ancient angelic beings and all those different lion-type creatures and serpent-type creatures and things that are in the abyss. Are coming out just before the midpoint of the last 7 years, and just before you have the war in heaven in Revelation 12. Well, all of them will be cast down to the earth at that time. And so you have fallen angels who aren't in the abyss and demons that aren't in the abyss who are working around the outer edges to help bring the world along until the seals are open, and then they can bring on the rendezvous with destiny.
It's a lot to take in. Do you think that when God said the Noah's Ark and he takes his creatures, he puts them on the ark, all the other ones, all the chimera creatures are destroyed because they're crossbreeds, they're flesh-eating animals, or is everything that comes from God a pure, loving? There's just a spirit about it that's not carnivorous.
No, not necessarily that. No, because you've got two types of animals. You've got clean, which is taken on with 7 pairs, and unclean, which is 2 pairs or 1 pair that go on the ark. So obviously, you've got the vegetation eaters, which aren't eating dead things, that are clean, and then the other ones, which include the carnivores, and they're called to the ark by God, not Noah. Those words, when it says, as God commanded him and he are inserted there. There's no Hebrew word there.
Okay.
God commands the animals to come to the earth, and he's only calling representatives, or a kind or a species that represents the animals that are going to repopulate on the earth. So not every variation of every horse, for example, or whatever, just ones that are required to repopulate. He doesn't call the chimera. He doesn't call the unicorn, which is like a chimera, right? It has like goat's hooves, and it has a lion's tail, and depending on which version, whether it's a horse's body or a different kind of head, this mythos of this animal that was used for Nephilim to ride on going into battle, because it needed to be bigger than a normal horse. And it had a horn that could kill an elephant and rip its stomach right out with one thrust. Was ideally designed for the Nephilim for battle. It doesn't get called to the earth. So just like the Nephilim, they're gone with the flood, and so are the unicorn. And I would say all of the animals that were created that were either not saved by the fallen angels or somehow recreated again after the flood, right? So it's designed to get rid of all of those animals.
This unicorn thing is crazy, because we see them all over like little kids stuff now, and you're like, oh, this is actually like a war horse for a Nephilim that was meant to friggin' destroy elephants. Okay.
And it's on the coat of arms, like with the Hanover dynasty and the Stuart dynasty and the British dynasty, just as a lion is. And again, that's also another kind of Nephilim like this. And usually the unicorn has this S-shaped chain attached to it, which usually goes back to Azazel, as Azazel is shown in Rosalind hanging upside down with an inverted Z or an S, representative either being hung in Orion, as the occult likes to believe, and or in the abyss, as Enoch in the Bible would suggest. And so this unicorn is a single-horned word that is inserted into the Bible for the Hebrew word rem, which is wild bull or ox. And so this is done at the time of King James and Bacon again. And what's interesting about that is King James called himself the mighty King James. Notice, underlying mighty goes back to describing Rephaim with Atzim and being very powerful, and or Gibborim for the Nephilim. There's no coincidence. And he also wrote the book Demonology, which again, I won't go too far down on this rabbit trail, but sticking with the unicorn. This is also, I think, in preparation for the brainwashing for the end time, because Antichrist comes out of the 10-horned empire as the little horn rising. And as out of Daniel, that's out of Daniel 7, and then out of Daniel 8, you have the horn of the goat, which is Greece, and out of that one horned goat will rise the Antichrist in the end time. And so I think they're setting us up with that insertion of that word for how they're going to usurp the Bible to say it supports the dragon Messiah for the end time.
Yeah, it's like a replacement, right? It's just a
counterfeit.
Yeah, it's a counterfeit, because a lot of people think, oh yeah, we'll it'll be obvious, we'll see it, we'll know it's coming.
No, you won't.
And it's like, no, it'll look and smell like the real thing.
No, because there will be other antichrists. So Gog, as I talked about Ezekiel 38 and 39, that Gog war, which is Joel 1 and 2 and the Revelation 9, 200 million man war. Gog, when you take that back to Greek in the New Testament, is not only is based on the Old Testament word for Gog out of Hebrew, but it also is an allegory in Greek for an Antichrist future figure, right? So you have Revelation 9 being opened. You have possibly all of these demons and giants that are going to have bodies and things. And then you have this Armageddon-like war, which I would call the counterfeit Armageddon, just before the midpoint of the last 7 years, that this Antichrist figure that I talked about as the unicorn figure of Daniel 7 and 8 will take credit for winning and will seal his, as one of his main credentials, as coming back on a counterfeit Armageddon.
Wow. And how do you defend yourself from all this? There's a lot of people that say that they, when they go out and even look for Bigfoot, that they have, they spiritually prepare because you don't know what you're dealing with. There's a lot of people who have really scary encounters, whether it's abductions, people go missing for 2 weeks and then they mysteriously show up. They don't remember what happened. Werewolf creatures come around. They're haunting graveyards. There's some association there of people being manipulated and attacked. How do you defend yourself?
You want to be very, very careful, because if you understand that there's, the good side and the bad side, and I'm not, from my perspective, using that in that dualistic polytheist, but because one side wins in the monotheist side as opposed to perpetual war.
Yeah.
And if you also understand that seemingly you have to let your guard down and let them in, and you get all of that allegory that's coming out throughout history and throughout literature. So that, let's say with a vampire, which is Dracula, which goes back to dragon drinking of blood, it's an allegory for the patriarchal bloodline of the Nephilim. Just as Prince Charles takes his genealogy back to Vlad the Impaler. I'm going down another rabbit hole. I'll get back on track here.
I love it. Love it.
You have to invite those beings in, or let down your guard to let them come in. So if you're going out to meet them, you better have your spiritual armor on so you don't let them in. This possession aspect is not a symbiotic relationship. It's not an avatara relationship. And when I talk about that, it's like Shiva or Vishnu as being an avatar with a symbiotic relationship with a human being that would be like Buddha. Right? Or Narasimha, which is the lion god, which Aslan and Narnia was based on as an incarnation, right? Demon possession, and just as Satan entered into Judas as the avatar of Judas the Avatar to help Judas over the threshold to betray Jesus, right? And possibly even with the Nakash, that Satan would have entered in the serpent to betray and lead Eve astray and Adam astray. So we have biblical examples of an avatar, which is a symbiotic relationship, which I think Antichrist will have because he receives his power from the dragon, and or Azazel, which I think is Abaddon Apollyon, which is another rabbit hole. But you have this aspect of demon possession, which is not symbiotic. It suppresses the host, and it manifests itself in all sorts of horrible violence and war going on within that body with this stronger spiritual being until it's being removed. So you want to be careful that you're not opening yourself up to that. So when people will say, well, how do the people in the occult let these things in? Well, some of them, it doesn't work out very, very well. But if it's an angelic being, it's going to be more of a symbiotic relationship.
Do you think all this is going to come on the backs? I mean, it sounds like the end of times is going to be like this religion. Is it coming out of the Catholic Church? I mean, are we going that far? Do you think that they're the biggest organization in the world? It seems like there's many stories of them hiding giant bones and other things. I don't think everyone is corrupted inside of it, but is it compromised? Are all institutions compromised, I guess?
Yeah, I think they all are, and particularly at the leadership level and controlling the seminary schools, because they all don't want to teach about giants and prehistory. They don't want to teach about prophecy. So I think they're compromised from that perspective. So we need to be careful of the leadership. They also, along with the Rosicrucians and the secret societies and the Freemasons, have the two largest storehouses of history. which includes all sorts of things like those bones.
Huh.
And so I think, yeah, they have that information. I also think, and again, a lot of people will disagree with me, but if we look at who the end time religion is they are a universal religion, as the allegories defined within the Bible suggest, and based on what happened at Babel. So it is a religion. It is a universal religion, as she'll sit on all the waters and will bring about the 10 King Empire, but it's also a powerful organization and a city.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people will say New York is the ancient city. Well, it's not an ancient city, so it has to be an older city than that. Or some people will say the U.S. is Babylon, but it's still got to be a city. I think it says in Revelation 17 and 18, it's a city like 9 or 10 times. So it's clearly a city that's going to be destroyed by Antichrist at the midpoint. But I also think that we have to understand the other details where it says that it sits on 7 hills, which the Vatican does, and that the Templars, who were a Gnostic organization created within Catholic Church by Gnostic monotheist organizations like the Cistercians and the Benedictines, who had a couple of members of the original Knights Templar, and also understand that there are all of the bloodlines, including of the Anjou and de Payan and de Bouillon were part of that bloodline out of Lorraine. You have that organization that set as part of their doctrine, as set down in their charter and written and recorded by the Master Roncelin, and I have that for people if they want it, that they wanted to take over the Catholic Church to create the new Babylon, quote unquote, new Babylon. And so that was in line with setting up their new Atlantis and their new world order with this universal religion. And then the Jesuits were created by the secret societies after the Templars were taken down. And they were actually called the New Templars to do the same thing. So I think everything is pointing towards getting control of the Catholic Church, changing its doctrine, but they're also going to need more to envelop Christianity in Protestant movement as well as the other religions around the world. So they're going to need false prophets, and they're going to need predictions of catastrophe to convert to the one world religion, which I think probably connects back to all of the Mary apparitions, and then the 6 who have been initiated out of Medjugorje in the 90s with a set date to come out with those prophecies of doom. Understanding that Pope Francis has fully recognized most of the visions at Medjugorje now.
Wow. So to wrap this up, there could be eventually all these chimerical creatures could come back. There's going to be some sort of supernatural event where there's a physical war going on with creatures, humans, a dogfight to the end. You know, like Bigfoot could come out and war with the other side kind of thing. Like, is that a thought?
Well, I think what's going to happen is there has to be, that encounter of the fourth kind, right? Where you have an introduction of the whole alien mythos of all these different kinds of aliens that are fighting against the evil God of the Bible, right? So the most plausible way of doing that is to introduce these beings as being from other planets as opposed to other dimensions. And again, as in Doctor Strange, where you have in the movies where you have them trying to win the earth as this sort of one bastion against the dark lords of the universe and win a treaty to do that. That's what Isaiah 14 was talking about, to have a realm of their own, away from God and not ruled by God, as Isaiah 14 talks about. That's what they're fighting for. So you're going to have these creatures that are introduced as all beings that have been fighting this perpetual war, like in Star Wars, against the evil empire, with this mystical religion, which Star Wars Jedis have. And of course, that's all allegories laid over and throughout Star Wars, whether or not it's Anakin, which is, as I mentioned, Anakim, or Luke Skywalker, which really comes out of Norse mythology as
Loki.
Loki, that's right, the one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for
Skywalker,
clarifying it's not a Luke, because I don't, I don't need that.
So just to make that sort of clear, that's how they're going to set it up. And they're going to have these wonderful weapons. And again, that's why we are being fast-tracked, I think, with the technology to be able to make that stand and fight with them. So yeah, you're going to be introduced to all of these creatures in a different format than the mythos has had for them, right? But it kept that tradition alive, and people will say, okay, that makes sense.
Luke, and it's funny, some people don't even believe in Bigfoot, let alone any of this other stuff. So, I mean, people have a long way to go. I mean, hopefully by now our listeners have been introduced to the crazy world. It's like the movie The Matrix. I keep thinking about The Matrix. We're all asleep in this system that's created by the entities, and when you decide to come out of it and see what's actually going on, it's not pretty. It's a little frightening. It's a little scary.
Well, and the Matrix is a wonderful allegory of that same belief system, where the physical world is this projection, and humans are enslaved in ignorance and are asleep. And all of the figures, whether or not it's the Merovingians that are in there, come out of their history, or Morpheus, which is the god of sleep and of dreams. I mean, all of this is based on their history, and I won't go through all of it, but once you understand the language that they talk, you'll understand what they're communicating in their literature that strikes a deeper level of meaning for the adepts.
So what it sounds like to me, and let me just say this, is everything I'm hearing is that we're looking forward, or we're looking at a future that is a combination of The Matrix, Star Wars, Harry and the Hendersons, and Independence Day.
Right. Yes. And the fairy tale is just the surface narrative. And you need to understand the characters and the allegories that are in there to understand the real story. And that's how they're going to portray the Bible in the end time, that you need to be using the interpretive approach and an adept of polytheism to understand what the Bible really means. And they're going to change the meaning of the Bible in the end time.
Wow. My last question for you is, of all the chimerical creatures and all the things you've heard, what is the one that you think is the most credible or the most fascinating to you?
I like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's just such a fascinating story, and it's we don't obviously have all of it, but we've got parts of all 12 tablets. But in it holds so much, including talking about Mount Hermon with King Habada, who's a chimera-type king of the cedar forest, right? Gilgamesh, who is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, and is created after the flood. And then Enkidu, or Enkidu, depending which translation you're talking about, is also created 2/3 god, 1/3 human after the flood to offset the evilness of Gilgamesh, but they soon become friends. They go and kill King Habada of the cedar forest on Mount Hermon, who is known as the Terrible One, to bring about all sorts of destruction and horrible things to humankind. They're going to kill him. And he has, just unbelievable. You'll Google all the different things that he's kind of got these different parts on. And what's interesting about that is at Mount Hermon. And Ezekiel 31, 32, Isaiah 14, and other chapters talks about the terrible ones and the branch of the terrible ones in Isaiah 25. So you get starting on a linkage of this Rephaim branches after the flood. But within the Epic of Gilgamesh story, you have the story of the flood story with Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra, again, depending on which translation you're referring to. And he is the archetypical Nephilim figure before the flood, 2/3 god, 1/3 human, and all of his family. So you get a survival story of giants, and you get a recreation of giants within the Epic of Gilgamesh, various stories, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And that is more of a real sort of accounting, as a parallel story of the flood, and as opposed to fictional writing. If you're asking me about fictional writing, although I do understand some people might say Epic of Gilgamesh just might be a legend and a mythology, I get that. I would probably say I really like, a few of them. I like The Matrix with all of the allegories and things that they've got in there. But, the Narnia tales are just so explosive with so much genealogy, so much history. And it's been targeted, which also has my fascination, to the children. And so, everything that's in there is about occult history. You even have satyrs in there, for crying out loud, which are goat gods, right? Mr. Timnus, for example. and also like Star Wars, because that's loaded with a lot of allegory as well, and more about their religions. So they have a lot of great writing and a lot of great storytelling. So they're very gifted at that. But I'm also, when I'm reading any of it, I'm looking as much for what else are they putting in here that I need to be aware of.
My mind is just like swimming with the ancient world, with centaurs, fauns, sirens, sphinx, fairies, werewolves, all these creatures running around. You have giants, various sizes, different types, different breeds, gods, fallen angels. We certainly do live in kind of a boring time. Back then, it must have been a little more interesting. You had a lot going on. Where can our listeners find you and get involved with what you're doing, and what are your plans for the future?
Well, if people want to get a hold of me or get a copy of my book, the best location to go to is my website. And that's the Genesis6conspiracy.com with the number 6conspiracy.com. And my email address, or you can get a hold of me through the website at, contact the author, is genesis6conspiracy@gmail.com. So it's basically the Gmail address to the website. And if you want any information or ask me a question, and I have documents on a lot of things that we're talking about today. So if people want a deeper set of information on that, get a hold of me through the website. Also on the website, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters, so you'll get a good feel for the book, whether or not it's the book for you or not. And if you want to buy a signed copy, you can get one off the website, or you can link over to barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com, or the Kindle version. And it's also available on other online websites, and it's available through your store, whether it's on the shelf or not. They can order it through Bookmasters out of Pennsylvania if you want to support your local bookstore. You can also get a hold of me under Facebook under Gary Wayne and message me there, or in my group Gary Wayne and the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. You can join that group and ask questions, or on Twitter at GaryWayne63 at GaryWayne63. If you ask me a question or wanting a document, I will get back to you.
Yeah, and if you're Nate's grandma, make sure you get a hold of Gary.
Absolutely.
I don't know if she knows how to download a podcast, but she sure as heck, she still mows her lawn and she still reads about the giants, and her mind is open and ready. And we hope that all you guys listening, your minds are there too, to see all this stuff for the first time maybe. Gary, fascinating. We'll have to have you back on. Keep going. Learn more about these creatures.